On this episode of The Eternities, the journalist, writer and editor Tom Shroder.
Anecdotally, he was having tremendous success, and his reputation was that people accomplished in a few sessions with him what they couldn't accomplish in 15 years of traditional therapy.
Tom Shroder is an award-winning journalist, writer and book editor. He is, amongst other titles, the author of Old Souls, Compelling Evidence from Children Who Remember Past Lives, now a classic of New Age literature. His latest work is Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy and the Power to Heal, a look at the therapeutic powers of psychedelic drugs. I started the interview by asking him what drew him to this subject.
Well, it's kind of a long story, but, back in the day when I was in college, I had some psychedelic experience myself, and it made me realize that this was not a frivolous thing, that it was actually something that could sort of change your life in a positive way. And I remember one instance where as the drug took effect, I began to just really be aware of all these anxieties and fears that I had, both, like about what was going to happen in the next day or two and what was going to happen 10, 20 years down the road. And it just became, and it became this palpable weight, like it was like this, then I kind of saw it as like a vision. It was like a boulder on my chest. It was like making it hard to breathe. And then in like this flash of insight, I realized I was the one that was holding that boulder to my chest, and that all I had to do was open my arms and it would just fall away. And from that moment on, because this wasn't like an intellectual thing, because of the psilocybin experience, it was palpable and very real to me. And so I realized that, that with negative emotions, there was always a degree to which you were choosing to feel them. And the rest of my life, I've sort of worked on the ability to simply let go of those negative emotions. And it's never easy, but having had that experience where I saw it, where it was like a real thing to me, that made it possible. And it's kind of a muscle you develop. So, ever since, and this was, close to 40 years ago. And that, that's not the only thing like that, but that's something that's easy to describe. And so I've always thought that psychedelics had some serious value. And then at the same time, when I was in my early 20s, I was at the University of Florida, and I was the editor of the college newspaper. And I was home on spring break, and that was in Sarasota, Florida. And for some reason, I became aware that there was this like hippie building this magnificent house in the woods on his own, cedar and stone and this fantastic stained glass window. And it kind of looked vaguely like this big pyramid. So I thought it would be an interesting feature story for the magazine supplement for my newspaper. So I sort of went to where he was in the woods, and this guy had a pet wolf that he played with, and he was a really interesting guy. And it didn't end up in the article, but he was basically, what he was doing with this house was trying to turn the things that he had learned doing psychedelics into concrete reality and to kind of integrate them into normal life. So I thought that was really interesting. Then 10 years later, I had become the editor of the Miami Herald Sunday magazine named Tropic. And I saw a notice in the Tampa newspaper about this perpetual college student who was proclaiming that MDMA or ecstasy was going to revolutionize psychotherapy.
So what year are we talking about then?
This was 1985. So I did the article on the hippie in the woods in 1975. So in 1985, I came across this, and I looked at the guy and I thought, that is the same guy that was building that house in the woods. I couldn't believe it. So I assigned a reporter to go do a cover story on him, and I think we headlined it a Tim Leary for the 80s. Very interesting story. He was kind of this wild guy, and went about my business. I would say maybe close to 19 years later, 18 or 19 years later, I was editor of the Washington Post Sunday magazine. And I saw a little article in the New York Times saying that Harvard had just approved the first psychedelic research since they booted Tim Leary out. And then as I was looking closer, I saw that the research was funded and sponsored by an organization called MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And the founder and director of MAPS was the same guy. So I thought, that's just nuts. This time I'm going to write the story myself. And I called him, Rick Doblin, his name is, and he not only remembered both those interactions with me, he actually had both stories sitting on his desk. And he said just that morning, the morning that I called, he'd met with his board of directors and showed them the stories to try to sort of impress upon them how far he'd come in his image, from this Tim Leary wild man to this founder of an organization who's funding a study in the most prestigious institution of research in the country. And so I did that story, and the research that I had that I read about in the Times actually never really went anywhere, because in spite of the fact that he felt he had reformed his image so much, he was still a problem. What happened was McLean Hospital, the Harvard Psychiatric Hospital, had changed directors, changed presidents right in the middle of this. And the new president said, we don't want anything to do with Rick Doblin, because the stigma was still really powerful. And the research never recovered. However, they were doing another study of using, the Harvard research was using MDMA to help people who had terminal cancer and had end-of-life anxiety and depression. But the other research, which really was more, I don't want to say it was more interesting, but it seemed more important in a way because of the number of people involved. But they were doing a study on using MDMA to help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And these were mostly women who had been the victims of rape or sexual abuse and had long-term treatment-resistant PTSD as a result. And this was going on in Charleston, South Carolina. And there was a psychiatrist named Michael Midhofer who was doing these studies. So I went down there, and I was just blown away by talking to these people who'd been through this study and, who had had PTSD for decades in some cases, and who had tremendous breakthroughs, and their symptoms had just all but disappeared after. And so that was I think this was in like 2004 or 5 or sometime around then. And right then and there, I wrote the magazine article, and I knew I wanted to write a book about it. And I also knew that they were planning, that they wanted to do a study because of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were underway at that point. People were beginning to come home with severe combat related PTSD. And it would turn out that as many as 500,000 American vets were going to come home from these wars with PTSD, a huge problem for them, for their families, for the whole country. And so they wanted to do a study of using it for people who have PTSD related to traumatic experiences in war. And I thought, that's when I want to do the book, was when that happened. So I had to wait a long time for that to come about. And then I had to make sure that enough of the vets would talk to me and open up fully. And fortunately that happened. And that was when I wrote the book proposal.
So have those vets continued to have been receiving MDMA therapy in the last 10 years?
Well, the vets this study started in 2010, and it's still ongoing. It's expanded to include police and firefighters who had traumatic job-related incidents that caused their PTSD. And they're almost all the way through. I think they've done 21 of 24 subjects that they're going to enroll. And, as I said, some of them were done as far back as 2010, including the main character in my book, or one of the main characters, a Marine named Nicholas Blackston, finished his therapy in 2012.
Yeah. So the book, the scope of the book is the history of psychedelic therapy going right back to the 50s, and you've focused in on three characters, haven't you? And I think you've mentioned them all now: Rick Doblin, the psychiatrist Dr. Mithofer, and the Marine. Has the Marine Nicholas Blackston, is it? Has he finished his therapy? Yeah,
he finished it more than 2 years ago now.
And what's been the net result of all that?
Oh, I think it's not too strong a word to use. He was cured of his PTSD. And he feels he was given the tools not only to sort of get past his PTSD, but to deal with new stresses in his life. And he has plenty, because he married a young woman who has a terrible, incurable and degenerative nerve disease called Friedreich's ataxia. And so, he's really been dealing with a lot. And in fact, now she's pregnant, and they're going to have a child in February. So he's on top of the world. He's doing great.
Yeah. So what made you focus, or what made you write the book by focusing on these particular three personalities?
Well, Rick Doblin is just a fascinating character. He's a completely self-invented expert on this. He wasn't finishing college. He was a college dropout for years. And
isn't it true that he dropped out to use psychedelics to further his own sort of self-studies on his own psyche?
He went home and he said to his dad, he says, "Look, I'm gonna drop out of college because I want to find out more about doing LSD. And there's this place I want to go to out west where I'm going to learn about LSD, and I want you to pay for it." And his dad said, "Okay." But I'm one in a million things. But Rick, from the time he was little, he felt that, he comes from a European Jewish family that had lost people in the Holocaust. He grew up in Illinois, and from a very early age, and his father, his grandfather had, on both sides really, they had successful businesses. They made a lot of money. His father was a successful doctor, and he was very aware. I'm talking about when he was like 12 years old, that he was in this privileged position where, he was in a family with a lot of money and a lot of resources. And he thought that he could do what he could do. He could take advantage of that position by helping deal with trying to beat back that kind of cultural insanity that resulted in the Holocaust. And this is a 12-year-old thinking this, so it's very unusual.
Yeah, so
And
I was going to ask, what role did the psychedelics have in shaping his own, unique sort of trajectory? But it sounds like he was already on an interesting path from an early
nobody
age.
in his family so much as drank coffee, and he didn't drink. And again, a very serious kid, widely read. He ended up going to New College in Sarasota, Florida. And at the time, this was a sort of a liberal arts, small experimental college. This was in the early 70s. And he gets there and he discovers that he's a very shy guy. He barely was able to talk to girls. And he goes to the school swimming pool. This is in beautiful Sarasota, Florida, year-round summer weather. And and there are all these young, nubile women frolicking in the pool naked. So that's the first thing you notice. And then at night, they're having these dance parties where a significant portion of the people are tripping on LSD. And he was very much against drugs, except that when he was in high school, there was this one kid he knew who he knew had taken LSD, and he assumed that that meant the kid was brain damaged, that he'd done something horrible to himself. And yet the kid seemed completely normal, not only normal but smart and funny. And the kid said, "You know what? You should read this book." And it was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So he read it, and he really read it in a smart way. I mean, he understood that Big Nurse was kind of like Hitler, and that sort of hatred and scapegoating, which was exactly the thing that he kind of felt put on this earth to fight. That it was just incredibly beautifully expressed in this novel. So when he finishes it, the kid says, "Well, Ken Kesey, the author of that book, wrote it while on acid." And this made Rick sort of, it opened up this little window in his mind that, it sort of confused him, but, that maybe, but it put together in his mind this idea that possibly LSD wasn't the demon drug that he had thought. So when he was in the situation in New College with the naked, dancing, frolicking, taking LSD thing, he tried it. And he had a very powerful experience where he saw his own limitations very clearly. And he understood that he was underdeveloped as a person, and that if he wanted to accomplish anything, that he would have to work on himself first. And he also saw that unlike, he had been bar mitzvahed when he was 13, and he kept expecting that to sort of make him an adult. He really sort of bought into that. And when he woke up the next day and he was no different, he was so disappointed. Well, now, 4 or 5 years later, this LSD trip, he's having that kind of conversion experience that he was naively hoping for on his bar mitzvah, which of course didn't materialize. So suddenly he thinks, this is very difficult and challenging because it's showing me all my weaknesses, and I keep feeling like there are things that I need to do to break through, and then I get scared and I pull back and I hate myself for it. So he was in this very difficult situation, and yet he continued to believe that the LSD experience would provide both the vision and the tools to sort of more perfect himself as a person. And he began going, and that's when he dropped out of college. He wanted to go study LSD, and he read a book by a man named Stan Grof. And Stan Grof was a researcher in Czechoslovakia who was one of the early people to experiment with LSD, and who was one of the first to see its therapeutic potential. And in fact, Grof in Czechoslovakia had done thousands and thousands of therapeutic sessions with LSD with great success. And he developed this whole theory of what was going on, that LSD, for some reason, sort of enabled the subconscious to deliver to consciousness exactly the issues that were needed by the people to sort of get over their problems. And,
What is the theory as to how the subconscious knows exactly, where the traumas are or where the sort of pathological imbalances are in the psyche? How can it know?
well, there are two tracks to this answer, and one is which is in its infancy, is really knowing exactly what's going on in the brain. But let's leave that aside because, that's, as one researcher put it, that's not really a picture yet. It's more like a crayon drawing. And the crayon drawing is a tremendous advance over where we were just a few years ago. So, but leaving that aside,
A what drawing? Sorry.
a crayon drawing, I don't know what the Brit word for the colored pieces of wax that kids use to make color.
Crayons. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it's a crude sort of.
That's where they are with understanding what's going on in the brain.
And it's kind of it's just based on sort of observations of activity in the brain, isn't it? Sort of rather than.
Well, it's based on a lot of sort of very clever things where, this is a whole different subject, but, some of this brain research, it comes from people who have had traumatic injuries to their brain and they've lost like a part of their brain. So they see what abilities that they lose. So then they think, oh, well, that part of the brain is associated with a certain set of abilities. And then it's progressed now where they're using various technologies like functional magnetic resonance imaging, where they can get a sort of snapshot of the brain's activity, not directly, but indirectly based on blood flow in the brain, etc. But anyway,
it doesn't seem like observing sort of those mechanics will actually explain as to why it's almost a self-healing that is going on with these psychedelic drugs.
And that's what, and in the end, humans had an innate healing intelligence in them. And the way Dr. Midhofer, the one who's doing the trials in Charleston, explained it was he had originally been an emergency room doctor before he became a psychiatrist. And he said, someone would come and they'd have gashed their arm on like they'd have fallen on their motorcycle and had a huge gash in their arm. And he says, I couldn't heal that. All I could do was remove the obstructions to healing and get the gravel out, clean it out, make sure that it wasn't going to get infected. But what really did the healing was the body, that the body had this innate ability to heal, and that he felt that it was the same in the psyche, that the psyche, if you remove the obstructions and give the psyche the room it needed, that it could heal itself, that there was an innate healing intelligence. And what Groff concluded was that the LSD experience allowed this innate healing intelligence to work. And it worked at first by bringing up just exactly the issues that were necessary to the person. And that he said that, and he did a series of LSD sessions with these people. And he said in each session, they got successively deeper and deeper into what the issue was until it was finally resolved.
Wow. And how many of those sessions would be required, or does it differ from person to person?
It varied from patient to patient. And he did quite a few. In some cases, maybe like a dozen or something. Over a period of months.
Yeah, I've had a couple of experiences with MDMA used in this way, which has been pretty revealing. Yeah.
And MDMA, and then MDMA sort of came about in the 70s. And
yet it was patented early 20th century, wasn't it? 1912, was it?
Yeah, but by the 70s, it was no longer, the patent had expired. So it was, what it was meant, it was sort of found in research looking for something else, and nobody paid much attention to it until the 70s, when a guy named Sasha Shulgin resynthesized it and had an experience that he instantly recognized as something that might be useful in therapy. He sort of had this feeling of like being almost reborn. It was almost like a conversion type experience. And so he told his friend, a therapist who had been using LSD and other psychedelics in therapy for years and was about to retire, about this. And the difference with MDMA was that the experience in a way was quieter. It wasn't as the shift in perception was more inward and not quite so outwardly dramatic, which had some advantages for therapy. And also it had this property of fear reduction, where all these things that are hanging us up as individuals, that it's usually based on fear. And suddenly those fears just fell away, and you were able to look at the issues just in a much more clear-headed way, without this kind of fear reaction, this clenching around it. So in fact, this guy Zeph did not retire, and he continued for another probably 15 years using MDMA in therapy and he never did any sort of real rigorous scientific studies of it, but anecdotally he was having tremendous success, and his reputation was that people accomplished in a few sessions with him what they couldn't accomplish in 15 years of traditional therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
But you were asking anyway. Sorry, this has gotten way off the answer to your question.
Yeah, was I asking how it could work? And you said there was two tracks.
Even before that, you asked me why I decided to tell the story in these three things.
Right.
And started off on what an amazing character Rick was, who just decided out of the blue, basically, that he was going to bring psychedelic therapy into the mainstream, just at the point when the government pretty much stomped down on it. They'd made it a Schedule I drug, which is putting it on the par with heroin. And all research was completely shut down, and anybody who expressed an interest in research, their career was ruined.
So when did they squash it all, first of all?
In 1970 was when they put it on Schedule I.
Okay.
And then, so he just decided that he wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a doctor, but he decided that in fact, he was a college dropout, but he decided that he was the one who was going to lead the effort to bring this back into the mainstream. And he ended up teaching himself the science, and he really knows the science cold now, and getting a PhD in public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard, because he figured he needed to learn how the system worked so that he could basically manipulate it. And when everybody else said, "This is impossible, Rick, this is not doable, nobody's going to let you do this," he refused to, and he had all these unbelievable setbacks.
That shows amazing commitment to go away and to study politics, just to get there in the end and change it.
Just a small portion of it, and he's trying to get the Food and Drug Administration to approve this research, and basically he's at this for 30 years before really it bore fruit, and he just kept at it, and so that was his part. And Michael Mithoefer is the one who became a doctor and then a psychiatrist, and sort of teamed up with Rick to do the first main big scale project with MDMA and PTSD.
Is it true that Dr. Mithoff, he became a psychiatrist because he was seeing what he thought were the results of mental illness in the emergency room in the hospital he was working? Yeah.
Yes, he'd be treating people who had knife wounds or who had like tried to hang themselves or taken pills, and he realized that all he was treating was the end result of a mental pathology. And he was doing things to people. He was stitching, he was shoving shoving tubes down tracheas, breathing tubes. And he didn't want to just do stuff to people at the bad end of the situation. He wanted to get in on the front end and to have a more collaborative relationship with his patients. So he became a psychiatrist, and because he had experiences in college similar to what I described for myself, and he always had the sense that there was some real power, some real kind of healing power in those drugs, even though he also had some bad experiences. So he was cautious about it. But he too read a book by Stan Grof. And Stan Grof, when they made LSD illegal, decided, well, I'm going to carry this work on through some alternative methods. So he did this survey around the world, and he decided that, that there were some traditional methods of reaching an altered state of consciousness. And Grof believed that it wasn't the LSD that was curing it. It was the altered consciousness that was curing it. So he said, well, if we can achieve an altered conscious some other way, then maybe that could be used in healing. And he came up with this combination of kind of hyperventilation and loud music, and which got people into an altered state and had some really tremendous effect. And he called it breath work.
Yeah, holotropic breath work. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so Michael decided to go out and study that and learn how to do that. And he had some very effective experiences with that. But he still felt that, there's some people who didn't take to the breath work. It was hard, it was sort of off-putting to some people. Some people couldn't achieve the altered state that way. So he still felt that, there were some people for who the psychedelic drugs would really be more effective. And he went down to Peru and spent a week doing with a shaman who was doing ayahuasca ceremonies, and had some really important experiences for himself. And when he came back, he really was saying that, I have these patients who are in horrible situations and nothing else seems to be working for them. So I'd like to try to bring this forward. And he saw Rick at a conference, and he went up to Rick and said, look, I want to do this research, but I know I can't do it in this country. So where do you think I can do it? And Rick said, you can do it here, and I'm going to help you. Because Rick was trying to find a psychiatrist who was willing to commit himself to this, and it was very difficult. So Michael just sort of presented himself, and it was like a gift to Rick.
So when was this?
And this was in about, I would say, the mid 90s or late 90s.
So Rick was sure that it would be able to be done, that research would be able to be carried out in the States?
Well, only because he was Rick. Nobody else thought that would be possible.
Okay.
But Rick was always convinced that he could do it.
Yeah.
And and Rick was not a psychiatrist, so he couldn't be the lead researcher. He couldn't do it himself. So he needed a partner who had credentials. And so they brought this forward, and they had this, and part of the book tells the unbelievable sort of battle that they had trying to get the FDA to approve it, and showing the incredible bias against psychedelics, which was so irrational, because nobody was treating this as just any other drug. Everybody was treating it as some kind of sort of huge taboo.
Well, can we just jump back a little bit?
Sure.
Because You said that it was starting to be used as a therapy, MDMA, in the 70s. How did it stay under the radar for so long? Because it was in
Oh, okay.
85. It was in 85 that it had the big hearing, didn't it? And
Yes, because what happened
yeah.
was that MDMA was a novel drug to the regulators. They didn't even know about it. And so it wasn't illegal until what happened was it was being used very quietly among therapists for a number of years. And inevitably, it popped out on the abuse scene. And it became this huge party drug in the late 70s and early 80s. It really exploded. And this got everybody's attention. And the regulators, it had taken them 10 years to make LSD a Schedule I drug, and they weren't going to make the same mistake. So everybody knew that the days that MDMA was legal were limited. And Rick really decided that, okay, LSD got illegalized right out from under him just as he was becoming interested in psychedelic therapy. And this time they could prepare for it. So he kind of rallied the troops and got a whole bunch of psychiatrists and therapists and researchers to file a brief saying MDMA is of serious medical benefit and should not be put on Schedule I. Schedule I is reserved for drugs with no medical benefit. In fact, it says that if a drug does have an accepted medical use, that it cannot be put on Schedule I. And they felt, people are using this in therapy successfully, so of course it has an accepted medical use. And they had this huge battle with the DEA over that, and they had this hearing that lasted a year. And ultimately, the hearing judge, said they were right on every front, that it did have accepted medical use, that it wasn't highly addictive, and that it wasn't, and that the potential harm was not off the charts. And the judge ruled for their group on every step of the way. And then the DEA, since this was an administrative hearing, the DEA was able to just say, sorry, we're not going to accept your recommendation. And they went ahead and put it on Schedule I.
But how could the DEA get away with that, and why would they want to anyway? Well,
because there was this whole sort of demonized idea that it came around when LSD became a drug of abuse in the 60s, and it got tied up with this sort of countercultural movement and this culture war that was just starting back then. And so.
So you don't see any conspiracy there? There's no conflict of interest with drug companies or anything?
No,
like that?
I think that, in fact, the big pharmaceutical company filed a brief on the behalf of Rick's group during this hearing because they didn't like the way the DEA was defining that they could just say what had accepted medical use and what didn't. And the drug companies thought that was a dangerous precedent, because they wanted doctors to be able to say what had accepted medical use. So the drug companies actually filed on me. These drugs were not a commercial threat to anybody because, first, they were generic drugs. They were cheap to manufacture. The suggested use was very light. I mean, they weren't talking about, like most of these expensive drugs that the pharmaceutical companies are making millions on, are drugs that you have to take your whole life and keep taking forever. Whereas psychedelic therapy, it assisted the therapy. You got better. You had no longer needed to use the drugs. So that same property made it so that the tremendous cost of doing the FDA research was almost impossible to bear by people who had no profits ahead of them. But anyway, this was really about a cultural bias and a cultural fear. and the fear, first of all, of the authorities that LSD was somehow inherently anti-authority, and the whole idea in our Western culture of rationalism and materialism, and LSD and the psychedelic experience in general sort of suggested a world where, that wasn't so Newtonian after all, that where things were connected in sort of mysterious ways. And I think that was just a sort of an existential threat to the people who were running the country. And, they got this idea that LSD would change people in a way that it would make them, quote, useless. And so that just sort of stuck, that LSD promoted sort of insane sort of thinking. And it was almost like it was almost like something that was deep in their psyches that they were afraid of. So that, I think, is more the case than it being an economic threat to anybody.
Yeah, but the tide seems to be changing. I mean, do you see any more resistance on the horizon? Any more sort of new sort of backlash?
The tide's definitely changing, and the reason it's changing is because they did good science, and our system, as biased as it might have been against psychedelics, certainly was based on belief that science could prove something. And science is proving the efficacy of these drugs. And not only that, but they're proving that used in clinical conditions, they're plenty safe enough. In fact, they're much safer than most other drugs used in psychiatry. So you can't argue with the science, but what's going on is that, as I mentioned, this process costs tens of millions of dollars. And Rick's organization, MAPS, is resorting to things like Indiegogo campaigns to raise $10,000 at a time. And it's going to take forever to do it this way. Meanwhile, we have a $1 trillion commitment to these 500,000 vets who have come back with PTSD in terms of disability and healthcare over their lifetimes. And there aren't enough treatments that help enough people with PTSD now. So the Pentagon should be, they have enough loose change in their couch cushions to fund this research and to put it on the fast track. And the FDA has the regulatory authority to declare this an urgent need drug and put it on a fast track that speeds everything up. Neither of those things are happening. The Pentagon hasn't contributed a dime.
I read that you got a strange response from a high-ranking military official when you tried to get someone to come on a TV program with you. Who said,
it was actually I was on an NPR show called the Diane Marine Show yesterday, and I was trying to get someone high up in the Pentagon health system to come on with me, and this was through an intermediary, and he wrote to the intermediary, said, "No, too dangerous for folks in uniform." And that just struck me with such force, such irony, that it's too dangerous to talk about this stuff when what's really dangerous is allowing 500,000 untreated vets to live with PTSD the rest of their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what would you like to see happen with regard to psychedelic therapy in the future?
Well, what I'd like to see happen is I would like to see the Pentagon, with their incredibly huge budget, begin to put this research on the fast track, and the FDA to also fast track it because it's an urgent need drug that's already shown tremendous promise. And, I think that with that kind of situation, there's no reason why they couldn't in 3 to 5 years be having this therapy be available widely. That's one thing I'd like to see. But there's another aspect to this, which is the nature of the psychedelic experience does not only benefit people with mental illness of some kind. The Johns Hopkins University is also researching psychedelics, and they did an initial study in which they gave psychedelics to simply healthy, completely problem-free volunteers. And what they discovered was at the end of that, 70% of the people who participated in the survey said that this was one of the 5 most significant experiences of their lifetime. And maybe more astoundingly, 30% said it was the single most significant experience of their lives. So that suggests something. And they said it was, and that it changed them in profound and beneficial ways. And this was a little bit what I was getting at in the beginning about, for the rest of my life, I've been able to look at these moments where I had anxiety and fear and negative emotions in a completely different and more productive way as a result of a psychedelic experience that I had. And I think that some of these people were, had a whole shift in their attitude about life. That same thing happened when they recently published results of a study where they helped people quit smoking by giving them psilocybin. And these people said it wasn't just simply that, it blocked my craving for cigarettes. No, it was like, they completely changed my sense of myself as a person, where before what was important to me was immediate pleasure. And now that's just not as important to me anymore. And what's more important to me is a long range health and well-being. And that's just a fundamental shift in personality. And it's the sort of shift in personality that almost never happens, in normal therapy or just spontaneously.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's I don't think these things are just for acute clinical cases. I think they're for hopefully for mass use.
But of course, then there's the issue of you don't want a bunch of 13 years old sort of running around and or 16-year-olds driving their cars around on acid. There's a guy named Bob Jesse who founded something called the Council on Spiritual Practices. And he has exactly this attitude. He says, look, I want to talk about how do we get to a point in our society where these drugs are available to healthy, responsible adults. And his idea is to sort of, to build some kind of structure around it, almost like a religion. I think it's a difficult question because certainly people can be damaged by doing this unscreened and unsupervised. And yet I know from personal experience that it can be a tremendously enriching thing. So I think that ultimately, just personally, I would like to have a legal availability of psychedelic drugs. And, my use would be like, a few times a year, I would do it as a sort of sacramental thing.
Yeah. I guess we could borrow a few tricks from traditional cultures that have traditions of shamanism.
Yeah, and not only that, there are religions that have a legal right to use psychedelics in their practice, like the Native American Church, and then there's various groups that have the legal right to use ayahuasca in their religious ceremonies. And they've done studies of Native Americans who have been using peyote, and peyote in rituals as part of their spiritual practice for 15, 20 years, and they don't have any physiological problems as a result of that use over that long period of time, and they're mentally and emotionally very healthy. And that's proved true of the people who use ayahuasca as well.
Do you think that our Western societies and the powers that be that run them are ready for this kind of evolution?
No, definitely not. But I do think, though, that I'm hearing, what's been interesting with the publication of Acid Test is the responses I get, and I've had a lot of excerpts printed in various places, from things like The Atlantic to Psychology Today to Salon, and the Washington Post, and the comments we get, they're not many comments that say, "Oh, these crazy drug fiends," Instead, they're saying, "Yes, I've had experiences. I know how valuable these drugs are," and those have been the responses that have predominated. So I found that really interesting. So certainly, I mean, there are millions of people in the U.S. and around the world who have had experiences that with psychedelics that they found to be valuable many years later. And in fact, the people doing this, moving this research forward all along, are in that group.
So the paradigm might be about to change finally.
I think it's sort of approaching a tipping point. But the first thing that will happen, though, is that these drugs will be available as a therapy for prescription use. I mean, nobody's going to ever hand somebody a prescription pad and hand them a piece of paper where they go to the drugstore and get psilocybin. That's not going to happen. But what will happen is that a doctor or a psychiatrist will be able to prescribe that they go to a clinic and have these experiences
Sure.
under those circumstances.
Yeah. And just the final point is, with my own couple of sessions with MDMA with a sitter as well in that situation you just described, a couple of things that came out for me seemed to be experiences that I've not had in this life, which I found extremely profound. A death in one, a very tough death seemingly, and in another one seemingly a suicide attempt or a suicide, which sort of links to one of your previous books, which was about reincarnation. I wonder briefly if you could talk a little bit about that, whether there's been anything in this book where they've found past life stuff coming into the therapy with these psychedelics, and also, is it true you went from being a skeptic about reincarnation and the research of the book Old Souls, was it?
Well, it's not quite that simple. Old Souls was about small children who seemed to have memories that matched up with a dead person's life. And in some cases, and in many cases really, some of the things these children seem to know about absolute strangers proved to be true to a remarkable degree. Everybody always wants to know, well, did you end up believing? And, I think where I came was more like it reinforced this sort of growing awareness I have that life and the universe is not this sort of thing where we kind of feel like we know what it is. We're wrong, and every time, even in physics, when you start pushing down to the smallest scales, like in quantum physics, or the largest scales in cosmology, everything starts to get more dreamlike. And it's almost like we're living in this dream, and everything looks normal until we start examining it more closely, and then it begins to waver and to hop around and to not obey rules that we think of as logic. So I think that it sort of more reinforced this idea that just about that life is this awesome mystery that we're never going to fathom. I think that's really more how it affected me. However, there are certainly Groff writes about during his LSD therapy sessions of sort of remarkable things of people coming up with incredible details of, let's say, a 17th century situation where somebody was beheaded. That was the vision they kept having. And where they gave all these details about a situation involving royalty and nobles, etc., and then later discovered that this person, through her father, who she had been estranged from, that this person had in fact descended from someone who had been beheaded in the 17th century, and that a lot of the details that she had come up with in this vision actually matched details, obscure historical details of the period that were recorded. So yeah, similar sorts of things happen in these LSD states.
Yeah, yeah. All right, I think that's about time up, and I think we've covered everything that I wanted to cover. Is there anything in particular, any juicy details that I've completely ignored here?
Well, I just want to. I also one thing that I haven't been able to talk much about is that I tried to write the book as a kind of nonfiction novel. I tried to give it a sense of story so that you could see these things unfolding and how it all came together. And one of the things I spent a lot of time doing was trying to get into the traumatic experiences that would create PTSD. And I did that through this Marine and his war and combat experiences, which I found very moving and profoundly sad. And also describing how PTSD was basically going to kill him because he was not going to be able to continue living with it if he didn't get relief. So I think it's really important that people can viscerally feel the urgency of the problem that this kind of therapy helps to solve, to understand exactly, how vitally important it is.
Great point to end. Very well said. And I wish you so much luck with the book. I think it's going to do some good things. So thank you so much for talking to me today, Tom. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Eternities, please help support the podcast by sharing it on social media or writing a review on iTunes. You can also help cover costs via the donate button at theeternities.com or by checking out my novel, Human Plus, available on Amazon or via the website.